All right, welcome everybody to the latest in our Solutions Seminar Series. Today we have Dr. Cliff Duke from the Ecological Society of America. He's with the Office of Science Programs. Cliff is a UVM alumni, 1977 in biology, was it? Environmental Studies, okay, good. And from there he went to Duke for his master's and Ph.D. and has been with ESA for quite a while. He's going to talk about linking ecological research, management, and you. So, Cliff.
Thank you, Bob. Started off by thanks to Smirdoshi for arranging me to be invited today. It's great fun to come back and be able to speak at my alma mater. When Samir first talked to me about this, I said, I'm not a researcher. What do you want me to talk about? And so we talked about this at some length. And what we decided is that we would organize this talk around opportunities for researchers, managers, students, et cetera, to be involved in some of the national activities that a professional society like the Ecological Society gets involved in. There are way too many programs at ESA to talk about all of them today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick 4 examples. I will aim to get through all 4, but I may not get through all 4, but at least 3. Give you some history, about how a scientific association gets involved in policy, talk about examples, and then at each point try to talk about how you can be part of that picture. So start off. My title is drawn from my elevator speech for what I do at ESA, Linking Ecological Research and Management. As a graduate of this program, I'm interested in solving problems. As Carl Rydell said a few years ago on the 30th anniversary of the program, that he envisioned the environmental program as a program that would allow people to become engaged in the quest to understand and resolve environmental problems. ESA's history of involvement in problem solving begins almost with its founding. The association was founded in 1915 at a meeting in Columbus, Ohio. And within 2 years, there was formed something called the Committee for the Preservation of Natural Conditions. A lot of people involved in the early days of the Ecological Society were interested not just in promoting ecological research, but actually preserving natural environments of various kinds. That effort led, importantly, in 1946 to the founding of something called the Ecologists Union, which we now know as the Nature Conservancy. Starting in 1950, became one of the biggest nonprofits on the planet, and of course famous for preserving landscapes. In more recent history, ESA has established 3 what I call program offices. These are strictly my own terms. In 1983, ESA established its public affairs office with just at the time a half-time person in the intent to establish a voice for the ecological community in national policy. In 1992, what is now the ESA Science Office, that I have the privilege of directing, was founded to implement the goals of the 1991 Sustainable Biosphere Initiative report, led by Jane Lubchenco and a group of others. Jane Lubchenco now famously being the administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I'll talk a bit more about SBI and its goals and where we came from in a minute. Thirdly, what is now the Office of Education and Diversity Programs became independent of the Public Affairs Office, where it had started just in 2001. Its mission is to increase the diversity in the ecology-related professions and to improve the quality of ecology education, something of considerable interest to hear, I'm sure. All 3 of our program offices both work together on some projects and also have their own independent programs. And what I'm going to do is talk briefly about the other 2 offices and then go into some more detail on the examples. Public Affairs Office has a number of activities that are focused on informing media and policymakers about sound ecological science. A wide range of activities. We have a rapid response team, which is a group of experts who have committed to serve a term to be available on call to work both with Congress, legislators, and so forth, and the media. ESA, or my colleague Nadine Lin, who's the director of the office, quite often will get a call from a staffer on a Congressional Science Committee, let's say, saying, I really need an expert who knows about topic A. Can you get them on the phone? Could you possibly bring them in to testify in front of a committee? Things of that sort. These folks essentially have pre-committed that they will try to be available for these kinds of inquiries, whether it's actually showing up in Washington, even just getting on the phone with a reporter, things of that sort. Also every year, and probably of interest to folks here, ESA offers graduate students the opportunity to compete for the Graduate Student Policy Award. And what that is, an opportunity for, I think typically we've got this year 4 students, an all expenses paid hands-on trip to DC. Get to go up and meet with representatives on Capitol Hill, talk to congressional staffers, and really get a feeling for the daily happenings in the policy world. Applications typically are open in early January, and then the winning applicants come to DC in the springtime. It's coming up, the next one's coming up soon, but I don't know exactly when. The Public Affairs Office also coordinates what are called ESA position statements, which basically state the position as the society in a very formal way on major issues, and typically provide ecology-based policy recommendations. These statements are vetted very carefully. They're reviewed by a public affairs committee that ESA maintains that works closely with the Public Affairs Office. And in the end, they're approved by our governing board. So if you see one of these position statements out there, this is really this society, in the name of its leadership anyway, taking a formal stand on some issue or another. We also take part in Congressional Visits Day, which a lot of professional societies in Washington do, which is a big coordinated effort to invite society members to come to Washington and meet with their members on Capitol Hill. If an ecologist from UVM comes to town, you might have the opportunity to meet with your congressman, with Senator Leahy or Saunders, et cetera, to talk about issues that are of particular concern to you. And as I say, this is coordinated with a number of professional societies, typically over the course of a week. People sort of hit the Capitol Hill all in groups. Then finally, or nearly finally, we have policy news, which anybody, whether they're a member of ESA or not, can subscribe to. And it comes out twice a month. It's a listserv summarizing major issues of the day, which is written by our policy person who works for Nadine Lin. And those subscriptions are free. A little bit about the Office of Education and Diversity program. The Education Office offers resources for students and for teachers. Resources like the SEEDS program, Strategies for Ecology, Education, Diversity, and Sustainability, which offers field trips and a variety of other activities. I'll talk about SEEDS in a little bit more detail in a bit. There is a SEEDS chapter recently established here at UVM. We have teaching resources. Teaching Issues and Experiments in Ecology is an online resource that has essentially all kinds of laboratory exercises that are freely downloadable for anybody that is looking for material to use in courses, typically at the college level, but they're also used in some high schools. Again, a free online resource. The EcoEd Digital Library is a related resource. The distinction being the TIE series is actually peer-reviewed. People submit things to TIE and they're reviewed by other educators to make sure they're sound and meet standards. EcoEd Digital Library gives the opportunity to submit things even as small as individual photographs that may be useful for teaching resources. And again, that's a free resource. It's available through the website. You see the various logos appearing here. And then finally, there's Profiles of Ecologists, which is actually being renamed Focus on Ecologists, which are essentially the stories that a number of professional ecologists tell about themselves in response to a set series of questions about how they got where they are. It's a great source of information on what motivates ecologists, how they made their career choices, what their career paths have been, things of that sort. To quote our education director, it offers a glimpse of life through the eyes of individuals trained in ecological science who had brought that experience into all sorts of different careers, many of which are still evolving. I think nearly all of our careers are still evolving, whether we acknowledge it or not. Circling back a little bit then to what I do at the Science Office. The office was established in response to this major report that was led by Jane Lidchenko back in the early 1990s. And what I find is that although this report is nearly 20 years old, a lot of its priorities that it identified are still very timely. And I want to cite a few with emphasis added by me. The first big one, remember this is 20 years ago, is global change, focusing on ecological causes and consequences of changes. Note that they were even then calling out in climate and in land and water use patterns. They were beginning to understand a little bit about what was happening with climate and clearly starting to focus on global land use. Second major research priority that they identified was focused on biological diversity, changes in aquatic species, habitat diversity, and so forth, and effects of global and regional change. Again, this was at a time when we're starting to understand that humans are affecting the globe as a whole. There aren't any more pristine ecosystems even at that point. And then thirdly, thinking about the topic of sustainability and sustainable solutions, which is part of what this series is about. Restoration of damaged systems, starting to talk about ecological restoration, management of sustainable systems, recognizing that human management is a requisite. We can't just let nature take care of itself. And looking at the interface between ecological processes and human social systems, which is what a number of you here in this room, including Dr. Costanza, are focused on. SBI also recommended much wider involvement of ESA in the education of students, the public, and decision makers, and came up with this very nice framework which links research, education, environmental decision making to ensure the sustainability of the biosphere, to quote the report. The linkage of these three still very much permeates the work of ESA, including our structure, the way our program offices work, and other professional societies and academic programs like those here at UVM. So what does the Science Office do now? What was initially called the Sustainable Biosphere Initiative Office, which was really independent of ESA headquarters back in '92, was incorporated into ESA formally as its Science Programs Office 5 years later in 1997. I joined the program in 2003. We now group our programs and projects into three broad categories, which are not mutually exclusive, but they do provide guidance as to how we choose and develop projects. First category we have is advancing ecological science. That's really about ESA's core mission, going back to its founding, which is to promote the continued development of ecological science as a science. Secondly, we have what I call ecology for community. This is the part where we are in service to the community at large, linking ecological research and management, integrating ecological science into decision-making and education. This encompasses, in many cases, projects that we do at the request of other organizations. The federal government contacts the Ecological Society and says, we really need a resource to peer review a major document that may have a bearing on decision. And we coordinate that review. We reach out, we find the experts, we form the panels, we help facilitate the process. Again, service and support of the community at large. Thirdly, what we call solutions for sustainability, which began a few years ago as an effort to start thinking about a new kind of sustainability science that would acknowledge constant change as opposed to switching from non-sustainable to sustainable, if such a thing were possible. To start thinking about the fact that even sustainable systems are going to be dynamic. We're now widening that concept to include work that we're interested in doing on promoting climate change science, sustainable fuels and things of that sort. And now for a few examples. As I said, I'm just going to pick several examples to talk about today to illustrate where they came from, where they ended up, and how individuals outside of the staff got involved in these. First one, I need to advance the slide. First one is a Biofuels and Sustainability project, which began about 3 years ago and is ongoing. What we call emerging issues conferences, which are opportunities for members to propose conferences and organize them with the support of ESA staff. The SEEDS program that I alluded to earlier. And finally, I'm going to talk about work that we're doing in data sharing if I have time. If I don't, people that are interested can hear about that a little bit later. So to start off with biofuels and sustainability, this project really highlights the "and you" in my title. This project originated with an email from an ESA member, a Forest Service scientist named Dale Brockway, several years ago, Dale had been to a meeting that was talking about the phenomenon of biofuels production and how it might affect agriculture and forestry. And Dale came away from that meeting very interested in this and sent an email to our then president, Alan Kovich from the University of Georgia, suggesting, quote, that ESA leadership may wish to assess the likely impacts of this emerging biofuels industry on ecosystems and summarize, what is known and what can now be predicted in a policy paper or one of its issues in ecology reports. Issues in ecology are summaries of major issues that we publish. Alan forwarded that email to me on the staff and to Richard Pouliot, who was then on a vice president on our governing board, essentially saying, are we doing anything about this? And Rich and I put our heads together and came back and said, no, but we can fix that. So what we did was we recruited Dale, among others. Remember, if you raise your hand, you're going to get picked. We recruited Dale and a number of other people into an organizing committee and started off exploring what we could do about the issue of biofuels and sustainability. And this effort led to a 300-person conference that we held in DC back almost exactly 2 years ago, where we had about a dozen invited speakers talking about all kinds of aspects of biofuels and sustainability. It was open to the public, or I should say open to anybody willing to pay the registration fee. About 300 people showed up for the day. Following that, we had a 2-day workshop, which was 50 people who were invited to participate. We were able to pay their expenses through money that we raised, to explore the issue of essentially, we've just heard what we know about biofuels and sustainability from these 12 experts. What do we need to know to really ensure that biofuels development will not have a whole lot of unanticipated adverse consequences? We want to do this nice green thing. We want to grow our own fuel. Can we do that in such a way that we don't make things worse or make things worse for other sectors of the environment? That was also followed, as I'll note in a couple of other slides, by a whole series of written products, including a publication in Science, a workshop report, and a series of other reports. So a little bit about outcomes. First outcome was an ESA position statement, which I alluded to before, which was issued in January 2008 before the conference, which articulated some principles that ESA wanted to talk about for biofuels and sustainability. That was followed after the conference with the Science Policy Forum that was led by Phil Robertson, professor at Michigan State. Some of you may know the name. Phil is very active in the agroecology field and in thinking about sustainable biofuels. Phil and about 20 of us co-authors were able to get into the pages of Science. And an ongoing series. These are 3 reports. There will be another one finished this month and a 5th one sometime later this year, exploring biofuels and sustainability in language written to be accessible to non-scientists. We have a series of these. The first one is about land use and biodiversity issues. The second one is about looking at forests as a source of biofuels materials. Third one on grasslands and rangelands. The fourth one, which is due out as soon as we can finish the layout, literally, will explore biogeochemistry and water issues related to biofuels. And the 5th one, which will get done later this year, will be essentially a synthesis of the first 4, trying to capture everything in one publication. A lot of other outcomes came out of this project. A number of presentations. My colleague Rich Pouliot spoke at the Department of Energy holds an annual meeting called Biomass, whatever the year is, every year in Washington. We had a presentation there. We also just recently at the 2010 meeting, which was last week, used that meeting as an opportunity to distribute a lot of these reports we've been generating. I had the opportunity to brief a National Academy Board, which is in the process of developing its own project exploring biofuels and environmental impacts. We had a Capitol Hill briefing led by Phil Robertson, a presentation that I made about the effort to the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry meeting, another professional society in the environmental field. This month in the ESA Bulletin, which is a free online resource that is available to all ESA members, and it's actually open access, anybody can read it. There'll be a report out of that workshop I mentioned, and there are several papers that are in review for publication in ESA's journal, Ecological Applications. I want to talk a little bit about the links of this process to the policy process and how we at least have attempted to have some impact on policy. National Council on Science and the Environment, which is another nonprofit environmental organization some of you may have heard of, holds a meeting every year in the wintertime in DC. And in 2008, they purposefully held that meeting in December rather than their usual January timing because they wanted to affect the transition teams. We had a brand new president coming in. There's a whole lot of people in Washington starting to figure out what the policies of the new administration will be. NCSE has a series of breakout sessions, 30 or 40 of them, where people get together in a room like this and talk through problems, come up with recommendations over the course of about 4 or 5 hours. We had a session at NCSE where we developed a set of these recommendations which were then passed on to the transition teams. And I want to highlight just 4 out of, I think, 10 recommendations we had. You need to link biomass for biofuels, research and development, and assistance funding to define sustainability standards. We can't just wave our arms and say biofuels have to be sustainable. We need to come up with some clear criteria for what that sustainability means. Second, we need to take a broad national inventory of biomass production. There's been a lot of work trying to figure out, how much corn can we grow, how much other kinds of plants can we grow, things like switchgrass and prairie grasses that might be used, forest materials. We really need an inventory of those materials and evaluate them based on what the impacts might be on biodiversity and ecosystem services. You've probably heard a lot about expanding corn, which is a pretty energy-intensive, fertilizer-intensive crop that is not that good an environmental player. We're expanding corn very steadily. We're expanding fertilizer use. So can we find other means to do that? Can we look at other crops? This is obvious, but it's always worth saying, I think especially in Washington. You need to base biofuels policy on sound science with participation from all stakeholders, not just the scientists, but the economists, the people that live in rural communities who are affected by these changes because they're growing different crops, having new industries brought into them. And finally, water use is a big issue in biofuels production, both because it takes water to grow the crops, especially the irrigation-intensive ones, and because the turning these crops into biofuels often takes a lot of water. To produce a gallon of ethanol from corn, I should say, takes something on the order of 6 gallons of water just to run the factory. And so you need to include consumptive water use and watershed impacts in your evaluations of biofuel life cycle assessments. A few overall observations to summarize the biofuels effort. First, to reiterate a little bit, biofuels production has multiple ecological dimensions, and we really need to be very thorough about doing our life cycle analyses and LCAs to look at the complete, essentially cradle-to-grave impacts of biofuels production. Everything from opening up the field to production, to growing the crop, to building the factory, to actually producing the liquid fuels at the end. Simply continuing what we do now, expanding existing feedstock sources like corn, sugarcane, etc., will simply exacerbate the impacts that we already know that high-intensity agriculture already has. Sustainable systems in biofuels can benefit the environment. Note the can, if we do it right. The rural economy and national security, if we can reduce imported oil and so forth. But again, that requires sound science-based policy. Quoting Phil Robertson, that is essential for guiding an environmentally sustainable approach to, quote, cellulosic, but really to biofuels as a rule across the board. A second example is what, for the first conference, was called the Millennium Conference Series. It has now been renamed very quickly into the Emerging Issues Conference Series that ESA has. This is an effort that was started in 2007 when then ESA President Nancy Grimm proposed that we should have opportunities for members to originate conferences that would highlight high visibility, exciting things going on in ecology. And the idea is that every 2 years we will issue a call for proposals. We just had one close last week, so that's the current one is now closed, where we will invite members to propose conferences. Simple proposals, about 7 pages, basically saying what's the issue, who's going to do it, why should we care about it. And the idea is that the winning proposal, basically what you win is the opportunity to work like mad for the next couple of years, organizing a meeting of 100 people or so to explore some idea that you think is exciting. And what you get with that is you get the support of ESA staff. You get the support of people like Cliff Duke and his colleagues helping you out to deal with the logistics, raise the money, which is key, things of that sort. So we do all sort of the meeting support stuff and the fundraising. The program committee does the heavy intellectual work, figuring out what the meeting should look like, what it should be about, who should be involved, and so forth. Conferences are intended to be small, no more than 100 people. Very interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, use whatever words you want, and to have active student participation. Our goal is to have at least 20 out of these 100 invitees be students with travel paid and so forth, so that dollars do not become an obstacle. And then have a series of invited speakers and contributed presentations as well. The first conference we just held with a 2-year planning window down at the University of Georgia in Athens. It was chaired by Stuart Pickett, who's with the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies, and Ted Gregson from the University of Georgia. And the aim of this meeting was to bring ecological and social scientists together to explore the whole issue of what happens with water availability in times of increasing shortage, because we're using more of it and because climate change is shifting patterns of water availability in the US and around the globe, and the fact that these issues have distributional consequences. Different groups of people, the poor especially, will experience these impacts differently. They'll also experience them differently depending on where they live in the country. The impacts here in Vermont are going to be different than they are in Arizona. And so the idea was to bring a broad cross-section of people together to explore how should society and the scientific community respond to that. So we spent 4 days in Georgia with a variety of activities. We had invited speakers from primarily across the country. Case studies, people were invited to develop case studies, video presentations, things of that sort that would highlight particular issues in addressing water availability. Poster presentations, a number of which were put together by students. We had about 30 posters presented at the meetings. Several field trips, people had the opportunity to go out and look at places where water availability was being addressed. Lake Lanier in Georgia, if you read about water issues, is the source of a very famous struggle between Georgia and the states to the south of it about using that water for public consumption versus some of the ecological needs for that water that occur in the Florida Panhandle. And we also had blogs from the meeting, which were written by our communications officer, podcasts that were made available, interviews with speakers, things of that sort. And we also webcast the plenary sessions so that people could tune in, like this meeting, from across the country and at least hear the plenary discussions. Out of the meeting, we're also getting some contributions to ESA's EcoEd Digital Library, which again, as I mentioned, is an online resource that people can contribute educational materials to. This summer at ESA's annual meeting, which will be in August in Pittsburgh, there will be a workshop based on a number of the case studies that were presented. So we're inviting back a number of the people that developed these case studies to Pittsburgh to a workshop where they'll be able to discuss their efforts in more detail. And then finally, pending funding, which is true of many projects, we have some plans for our education office to develop teaching resources for undergraduate students in ecology and social sciences, and possibly high school students. And the idea is that we want to put together 1, possibly 2 workshops where we would invite in teachers from colleges and high schools and basically teach them about some of the issues involved, provide them with materials that they could take back to their classrooms, and so forth, and that hopefully they could get the kinds of credit they need for, particularly for public school teachers who need continuing education credits, things of that sort. So we're hoping to develop that pending funding. Some of the recommendations that came out of this first conference, and I'm indebted to our former communications officer, Christine Buckley, for this summary. First, with respect to research and monitoring, we really need to develop techniques to understand the amount and quality of fresh water available. We don't know enough about what's out there, much less the impacts of variability or a drought, so that we can understand how much is out there and understand the quality and sustainability of water ecosystems. The understanding how much is available for humans to work with, recognizing that we also have water needs for all the other organisms on the planet, is an absolute prerequisite to figuring out how we're going to manage this especially in the face of the challenges posed by climate change. Second, education. We need to focus on really helping people understand the relationship between what they use and the water sources. A lot of us, it's the old, you don't know where your groceries come from. You don't necessarily know where your water comes from either, unless it's a well in your own backyard in rural Vermont. If you're sitting in Atlanta, Georgia, do you really understand that a large reservoir 30 miles away is the source of your water, and that water is also needed by endangered fish in Florida? So it's very important to establish those connections for people, and also to help people understand the economic and social issues associated with those. With respect to management then, which research and education need to feed into, we need to allocate, by necessity, you have to allocate managed water at a local or regional scale, but you need to understand it at a watershed scale, to understand where it's coming from, to understand what the impacts of variability are going to be, and also to understand the connectivity of systems. Watersheds are connected to each other, and they have to be prioritized in decision making, and we have to think very hard about the trade-offs between water availability for our use versus that of other organisms, which of course ultimately culminates in policy. Again, throughout this, we're trying to connect back to what are the impacts on policy. And here, one interesting insight that had not occurred to me in advance of this workshop, but came through because we had lawyers and social scientists there in addition to ecologists, is that drought doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. It has hydrological, ecological, meteorological, and sociological dimensions. What we would consider a drought in Burlington, Vermont is not the same thing that necessarily a farmer in the Champlain Valley would experience, much less what somebody in southern Arizona would experience. What we mean by economic drought is not necessarily the same thing that the weatherman means by a drought. And it's really important to identify these very different definitions in order to manage our responses. We have to understand each other's vocabulary. A few observations, just thinking about the organizational aspect. Again, I work for a professional society, and I want to tell you a bit about how a professional society functions. First, small can be better. You get a lot more opportunity for extended interactions, especially in a small meeting. ESA's annual meeting attracts 3,000 to 4,000, sometimes 4,500 people every year. We have 20 simultaneous paper sessions at any given time. You get to interact with a lot of people, but finding them is really hard, and getting to interact with specific people can be almost impossible. I've had years when I couldn't have found my best friend at these meetings. And ESA is relatively modest in size compared to some other organizations that have meetings of 10,000 people. Having meetings of 100 people can be really exciting. Disciplines are dynamic. Anybody involved in environmental issues knows that. And there's always a need to cross disciplinary boundaries. It extends back a century. The very first article published in the ESA Bulletin in 1920 is a speech by the ESA then president, who has this wonderful passage about the need to be interdisciplinary, nearly a century ago. We're still fighting that battle, and it's because it's dynamic. It doesn't go away. New disciplines arise, and you need to keep crossing those. And these kinds of conferences can help facilitate that process. This conference had, in my experience so far at ESA, a lot more collaboration among our various program offices than is typical. We work together. We work in the same place. We talk to each other all the time, but we don't necessarily work on the same project in an integrated way. This particular conference pretty much demanded that of us because of the nature of it. And that interaction in turn enriched the conference. The fact that the staffs are having to work together, the fact that the various advisory committees that work with us had also to cross those boundaries, made this conference better than it would have without that. And finally, we need you guys. Students are the source of the energy in all of these things. And that's a cliche, but it's an important cliche, and it's one we have to keep in mind. Which leads directly to my next example. The SEEDS program, which is managed by my colleague, Education Director Teresa Morad and their staff. Anything you see here, they get the credit for. Any mistakes are mine. But the SEEDS mission is, as I said before, is to diversify and advance the profession of ecology through opportunities. It's really an outreach program to, quote, underrepresented students in its initial mission, to encourage students who might never think about a career in ecology to go find out about it. We hope to get excited. We hope to have careers in it. The program's been around for about 9 years now. We have our first PhDs out of the program. We actually have had people who got excited about ecology as undergraduates and have gone on to careers. My colleague Charlie Glenn, who works for Teresa in running the program on a day-to-day basis, is herself a SEEDS alum. So we're excited about that. What kinds of activities does SEEDS have? One, of course, we have a network of campus ecology chapters, one of which is here at UVM. There are now over 50, I think maybe over 60 campus ecology chapters. They are mostly listed on the web, although we haven't quite caught up. UVM's is not listed there yet, but we try to keep our website updated. We have field trips to research sites around the country and more recently even to Mexico. Students apply for these trips. They're announced. The opportunity to go on them is announced through the website and through email and other means. Students apply and they get selected, and it's typically, I think, on the order of 20 students. They get to go to a wide variety of really interesting research sites. Some I would love to go to myself. They've been to places as far apart as Alaska. Next month they're going to Puerto Rico and various other places. There's also travel awards to the ESA annual meeting. This is for undergraduates. All these are for undergraduates. You can apply for a travel award, come to the ESA annual meeting with expenses paid, and be matched up with a mentor, typically a senior scientist, who will introduce you to people, find out what your interests are, help guide you to choose among these hundreds of paper sessions, literally. And there's also particular social events that are for the students themselves, dinners, lunches, workshops, and so forth, so that you can get to know the other students that are involved in the program and kind of find your identity in a group of 20 out of these several thousand people that are floating around you. There's also an annual leadership meeting where a number of the SEED students and the staff and our advisors in the science community get together somewhere for several days and explore what's the program doing right, what could it do better, what new direction should the program follow. And again, SEED students get to attend this meeting and participate in figuring out what the program should do next. And finally, Teresa and one more there. Teresa and her folks have starting to establish some international relationships. Currently, there's one with the University of North Texas and the Universidad de Magallanes, pardon my very bad Spanish, in association with an Institute of Ecology and Biodiversity in Chile. So there's starting to be some opportunities to be involved internationally. Teresa is also reaching out to contacts at the Chinese Ecological Society to consider establishing some formal links between ESA and China. So we're sort of trying to spread the SEEDS message first to Latin America and now potentially to Asia. A little bit about SEEDS field trips, just one example of this wide variety of activities. The field trips feature, as I say, visits to ecologically significant sites led by ecologists. These two pictures from Calgary up in Canada and Chiapas, Mexico. And so as I say, they go to a lot of exciting places. You get an introduction to the research that's being conducted there. You meet with the scientists and the graduate students who are in residence there. There's opportunities to participate in research as these trips last a week or more, and then there's sometimes follow-on activities as well. Obviously, you get to interact with both the scientists and the graduate students. It's not just people sitting in a classroom. You're out in the field with them. You're having dinner with them. You're spending direct time with them, and the groups are small enough that you get very direct connections with people. Obviously, what we at ESA hope is that you're going to have conversations about ecology careers, that people are going to get excited about this field that we devote our lives to and want to join us in it, and can find out what the many different pathways to that are. Students write up their own observations, their own journals. We've also had students write for the ESA blog. We have Ecotone, which you can see on the ESA homepage, which is a blog that's moderated by our communications officer, but we often have guest contributions. including, among other things, seed students blogging about their experiences while they're in the field, writing in every day about what they're doing, and thus generally sharing their experiences within the group. What can you do? Whether you are a student, faculty, graduate student, and so forth, there's a lot of opportunities to get involved. One, which is already happening here, you can start or mentor a campus ecology chapter or get involved in one. As I say, there are 50 or 60 of these. They're growing across the country. You have one just initiated here at UVM. And we're always looking for scientists and others to help mentor these. You can host a field trip to whatever your favorite research site is. You can propose these. The program finds the money to do it. The work you have to do is essentially the work of hosting a group of students for a week and finding activities at your favorite field station. And finally, you can mentor a student at the annual meeting. This is an opportunity open to graduate students, to faculty members, anyone, to sign up to be a mentor, basically to take on the responsibility of helping introduce an undergraduate student to all the multiple activities that happen at a National Professional Society meeting. I think I will have time to talk about data sharing, so I will go on to that. My final example is a series of efforts that ESA has sponsored and that I have been very directly involved in to promote data sharing and resources for it in the ecological community. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's important in a minute. This effort began with a recommendation that something called the Ecological Visions Committee made in 2004. The Visions Project, which is summarized in a Frontiers article that Margaret Plummer published, and for those of you that have access to the materials I forwarded to Samir, or for those of you who don't, I can get it for you. The Visions Project was really an effort to re-examine ESA's role in promoting the development and use of ecological science. I talked a little bit about the SBI report, which was roughly 20 years ago. Visions was essentially, it's time to take a new look at that. Things change over a period of 10 years. The discipline changes, the science changes. What should the science community as a whole be doing in response to these global challenges that we're all facing? The full committee report, there's a cover picture there, is available online. But a key recommendation of that report is that ESA should promote data sharing, standardization of data collection, documentation, and sharing. Why should we share data? Borrowing a slide from Jim Richmond, who helped initiate this effort. He's the retired director of something called the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. There's a lot of good reasons. It's good for the field. GenBank, which is a repository of genetic data, is a huge resource for people working in genetics. The Christmas bird count, which the Audubon Society sponsors, is a long-term record of migratory birds, which is enormously useful. It reduces data loss. If you share your data, if you put it in an archive, it's protected. It's available in multiple places. You can get greater synthesis and greater understanding through efforts promoted by things like the synthesis centers that the National Science Foundation operates, National Evolutionary Synthesis Center and NCES, which I referred to. Some archives are publicly funded, means you have a place that you can put your data, keep it safe, and still out in the public. It can help you give rise to new analyses and graphs. Sharing your data, you can put it in repositories, you can get access to all kinds of new tools, like swivel.com, which is a neat place to go find interesting data analytical tools, which is a free resource. You can find that your data get used for purposes not originally intended. Back in the late 50s, some people were interested in atmospheric science, and they started measuring the concentration of carbon dioxide on the slopes of Mauna Loa in Hawaii. They didn't think about climate change. They just wanted to know how much CO2 and other things were changing the atmosphere. It led to this very famous graph. Became one of the key pieces of evidence in understanding climate change as we do now. It was never envisioned for that purpose to begin with. And of course, there's all the wonderful rewards we get from data sharing. It's partially tongue-in-cheek, but we're trying to increase the rewards for data sharing. A little bit about what happens to information briefly over time, because that's another reason for getting your data out there in archives and so forth, and allowing other people access to it. There's what's called information entropy. This slide is from an article that Bill Michener, another expert in this field, published in 1997. Time of publication, there's a lot of information. You've got all your data. whether it's the notebooks on your computer, still in front of you. You know where it is. You understand it still. Over time, if you haven't made a really good record of it, you start to lose the details. Just how did I do that measurement? Just exactly what were the units of this particular data set that I had? So it changes. You start losing specific details, general details. Accidents happen. Laboratories burn down. When I was a graduate student at Duke University Marine Laboratory, a biochemistry lab burned down. Somebody lost their master's thesis. Their data all consisted of gels at the time. It simply disappeared. Accidents happen. People, of course, retire. They don't necessarily keep their data, or their institution doesn't keep their data. And, of course, at the end, death gets us all. What has ESA been doing about this? Well, over the last 6 years, starting in September 2004, we've had a series of workshops about this topic. We had the Society Summit in 2004, which brought together 12 professional societies, essentially to try to get some of the professional societies to adopt common policies about data sharing. We're kind of gatekeepers about data because we are the publishers. And we have some ability to say to people that are going to publish in our journals that we encourage you to share data, or in the event, potentially to require it. Society Summit started out with 12 professional societies. That set the stage for a series of 4 more workshops over the last 5 years, which has ultimately involved 22 professional societies and about 33 other organizations. What did we get out of that? A whole series of things. Again, a number of publications, ESA Bulletin article, a editorial in Frontiers that I wrote several years ago, the development of an ESA data registry, which is essentially a data registry is a database of databases. It tells you what data are out there, who's got them. It doesn't contain the raw data themselves. Briefings for a National Academy Board, and a couple of sessions and presentations at ESA's own annual meeting, essentially getting the word out about what we've done. I'm also going to have the pleasure next month of giving a talk at Auburn University just about this topic. Somebody down there was interested enough to actually devote a whole hour to talking about data sharing. Next step, we're in the process, I hope, of getting a small planning grant from EPA. We spent 5 years, 6 years promoting data sharing. Now we want to test the hypothesis that it means something. And so a group of us, pending funding, are going to put together a workshop and case studies to test the hypothesis that greater data sharing actually can improve environmental protection and conservation. If I get better data, will I actually do a better job of preserving air quality or planning the next great marine protected area, something of that sort. The you in data sharing. Again, all these things come back to you. Data sharing is an individual ethical responsibility. The risk of quoting my Frontiers editorial, it all comes down to the individual scientist. Technology is no longer an excuse for it. It's up to the individual to do this. And when you do that, it will enrich not just your own work, but science as a whole. So what's the common thread that I've been trying to build through these examples today? Major one is change. With respect to biofuels, we're vigorously and actively changing our sources of energy. That's going to have consequences for land use. Whether they are good, bad, or indifferent is the key. We have the opportunity to think that through. We're at the beginning of this industry. It's well developed, but we still have a lot of decisions to make about it. But our energy sources are changing. Water, the availability of water is changing constantly. Climate change is going to exacerbate and accelerate that. We're going to have changes in the frequency and intensity of rainfall, snowfall, and so forth. And that's going to change water's relationship to environmental justice. The consequences don't all fall on the same people in the same way. In the case of seeds, we're actually trying to change the composition of the ecological science community itself. We, or at least some number of us, have decided that we actually care who is involved in ecology, not just in the science itself, but who does it, because we think that that affects how it's done. And so we are actively encouraging people who are not necessarily visible in ecology to become so. And finally, with respect to data sharing, we're trying to change how we do the research, how we make it available, trying to change the core issue of how ecology gets done. Samir initially contacted me to talk about sustainability. What do these examples have to do with sustainability? Well, First, they illustrate sustainability, which no surprise to anybody in this room, I don't think, has not just ecological dimensions, but social and economic dimensions. And you have to work on all three of those. Sustainable solutions have to incorporate continuing change. There's no such thing as a balance of nature, despite what we would have liked to think once upon a time. And there's no such thing as a transition to sustainability. Sustainability isn't something where today we're going to be sustainable and unsustainable, and tomorrow we're going to pull all the magic switches and we're going to be sustainable. Sustainability itself is a dynamic process, and we have to make sure that we incorporate the potential for change into that. How do you help solve problems? How do you make a difference in sustainability beyond your research, beyond the education you're getting here at the university? You speak up. Professional societies are not just the journal that you get online. Once upon a time we got in the mail. They're not just the meeting that you get to go to once a year if you can find the funding and make a presentation. We are a lot of activities, a subset of which I've talked about today. How do you get involved in that? You can make that difference just by sending a suggestion to somebody. Write a note to me or to an ESA leader or to a leader of another professional society, the ecological economics folks that Bob is involved in. Make a suggestion, ask a question. It can be that simple. To conclude, quoting another UVM professor, Bob wrote in the first issue of Solutions about wanting solutions to move beyond the debate that dominates public discussion towards substantive and constructive dialogue between all stakeholders and in society. ESA and other professional societies are here to help you organize and facilitate that dialogue. Emphasis on the help and on the you. There's a lot of information that I presented. I'm going to leave a copy of the slides behind so people don't have to frantically write down URLs. ESA's website, like a lot of websites, is large and complex. These are just the addresses of the project I talked about today. I encourage you to explore esa.org if you want to learn more about us. But these are a few of the specific resources. And nobody does this kind of work without a lot of help, and I wanted to acknowledge some of my past and current program managers and program assistants that work for me in DC, my colleagues who run the public affairs and education offices, and lots of other staff, volunteers, and sponsors who stand behind all of this work. And finally, because I'm here at UVM, I want to thank UVM. This place got me started in this business, and I hope it gets all of you started in exciting careers in this field. Thank you.